Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a fascinating economic case study that absolutely perfectly highlights how surface level numbers can, well, sometimes hide completely different underlying realities. We're going to explore the Sri Lankan rupee and its wild fluctuations against the US dollar across two very distinct, highly consequential periods, 2022 and 2026. If you've ever looked at a financial chart and thought, hey, this exact same thing has happened before, this explainer is going to show you why you always have to look under the hood. We're going to break down the data, map out the timelines, and uncover exactly how two totally similar-looking financial events were actually driven by entirely different forces. So, here's the central mystery we're unraveling today. You've got a currency, in this case the Sri Lankan rupee. You look at the charts and you see the rupee dropping in value against the dollar. The dollar to LKR rate shot up significantly twice in just a few short years. Now, it is incredibly easy to jump to the conclusion that, hey, if a currency tanks twice, the underlying economic disease just has to be exactly the same, right? But is it? Can identical surface results actually stem from completely different root causes?
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our quick roadmap. First, two similar currency fluctuations. Second, 2022, the artificial crash. Third, the 2024 deflation pivot. Fourth, 2026, a market shift. And finally, number 5, comparing the root causes. All right, section 1, two similar currency fluctuations, the core phenomenon.
Moving right into section 2, 2022, the artificial crash.
Let's look closely at this absolute pressure cooker from 2022. First off, a vehicle import ban existed, heavily restricting what could come into the country, basically just to try and stop dollars from leaving. At the exact same time, you had large-scale money printing happening, and crucially, this was controlled directly by politicians. So you have way more local currency flooding the system. Now, normally, to control the resulting demand for foreign currency, a central bank would step in and raise interest rates. But here, interest rates were not increased at all. So you have a ton of money, huge demand for dollars, and what do the authorities do? They artificially kept the dollar rate at a fixed static number. They simply mandated what the currency was worth, completely ignoring the actual reality of supply and demand. And here is exactly what happens when artificial constraints meet harsh economic reality. Bam! The dam broke. Because the rate was kept artificially fixed while vast amounts of money were just being printed, the correction wasn't some gradual slide. No way. It was a sudden, violent snap. The dollar rate went from 200 rupees straight up to 400 rupees and effectively doubled almost overnight. This wasn't a market naturally adjusting. This was an artificial system literally collapsing under its own weight.
Which brings us to section 3, the 2024 deflation pivot.
Now, to understand what happened next, we can't just fast forward straight to 2026. The economy had to fundamentally alter its strategy to recover. In 2024, Sri Lanka experienced a deflationary period. Prices were actually contracting. Now, while deflation might sound awesome to us as consumers in the short term, it's actually incredibly dangerous for long-term economic growth. Economies run on investment, spending, and momentum, right? So to achieve actual sustainable economic growth following a deflationary period like that, a small amount of inflation is fully expected and, frankly, required. Because of this need to generate healthy, slight inflation just to get the economic engine running again, experts and markets fully expected the rupee to naturally depreciate a little bit against the dollar after this 2024 deflation phase. It was a planned, totally anticipated part of the recovery cycle.
All right, on to section 4, 2026, a market shift. Following our timeline here, we've got the 2022 crash followed by the 2024 deflationary period. And as we just learned, some rupee depreciation was already expected as a totally natural step for growth moving forward. However, in 2026, this expected natural depreciation aggregated with some massive external shocks. Major global conflicts occurred during this time. And for Sri Lanka, these global conflicts had a very specific, painful result: a sharp decline in revenue from exports and tourism. It's pretty simple math. Fewer tourists and fewer exports mean fewer US dollars naturally flowing into the country.
And this brilliantly illustrates the contrast. Look at the economic conditions in 2026 compared to what we saw back in 2022. That vehicle import ban? Removed. Money printing? It's minimal now, and crucially, it's handled by the central bank, not by politicians. What about interest rates? Well, they aren't being artificially suppressed anymore. They're being kept at the correct rates specifically to achieve a targeted 5% inflation rate set by the central bank. And honestly, most importantly, the dollar rate is primarily decided by the market. The economy is reacting to those global conflicts and the drop in tourism revenue naturally, adjusting its prices based on real supply and demand.
Because the system is functioning based on real market realities rather than artificial caps, look at how the currency adjusts this time. The dollar rate went up from 295 to 320, but crucially, and this is the key difference, this occurred gradually over the span of an entire year. It wasn't an overnight violent doubling like that terrifying snap from 200 to 400. It was a steady, market-driven slide reflecting the actual reality of lower foreign income and targeted inflation goals.
Finally, Section 5, comparing the root causes.
This matrix really organizes everything perfectly to clearly explain the difference between these two situations. Just look at it side by side. In 2022, vehicle imports were banned. In 2026, they were removed. In 2022, money printing was large-scale and driven entirely by politicians. In 2026, it was minimal and handled independently by the central bank. Back in 2022, interest rates were stubbornly static. Despite soaring demand, in 2026, they were actively adjusted to hit a specific 5% target. And finally, the dollar rate was artificially fixed in 2022, which led to that massive explosion, whereas in 2026, it was market-decided, leading to a nice, gradual adjustment.
When we look at the source analysis for these two periods, the conclusions drawn about their root causes are just striking in their differences. According to the analysis we're referencing, the sudden artificial crash of 2022 is attributed to what it defines as wrong political decisions to print money, freeze interest rates, and fix the currency. On the flip side, the gradual depreciation of 2026 is attributed to natural inflation, which, remember, was fully expected following the deflationary period, compounded by global conflicts that restricted dollar inflows. Which brings us to our final vital takeaway. We witnessed two identical symptoms, a devaluation in the rupee, but they were caused by entirely different economic diseases. One was an artificial structure shattering under internal political mismanagement and suppressed market forces. The other, it was a functioning market mechanism slowly adjusting to natural inflation targets and global geopolitical headwinds. It is such a powerful reminder that in economics, just reading the top-line number is never enough. You have to understand the environment that created it. So the next time you see a headline about a currency dropping or prices rising, ask yourself, are we looking at a 2022 scenario or a 2026 scenario? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you next time.